recently somebody posted a picture on Facebook that was talking about how it's inconsistent to say that homosexuality is a sin, but wearing a poly-cotton blend sweater is not.
Sure.
You know? And then some Christian got on there and said, oh my God, we live in the New Testament now. We don't live in the Old Testament anymore. This doesn't apply.
Cool, so let's chuck out the Ten Commandments.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's kind of sad that basically we're expected to know more about their Bible and their religion than they are. And whenever somebody just wants to shrug off the entirety of the Old Testament, I just pretty much look at them and shake my head, because when you when you do that, first of all, you get rid of the creation story. You get rid of the fall, which is the entire reason that you need some sort of sacrifice in the New Testament. You get rid of the Ten Commandments. You get rid of a butt-ton of laws. You also get rid of everything that Christians would like to claim as prophecy for their New Testament. And so if we just set all of that aside and we go with the New Testament, what are we left with? Well, we're left with a couple of obvious known forgeries, some anonymous documentation. By the way, the New Testament's also against homosexuality. Paul's very clear about that. So, you know, and then you've got the ravings of a lunatic to close it off with things that don't make much sense that people can interpret in any way they want. I don't really see much value in that, but if they want to be just a New Testament, you know, believer and not an Old Testament believer, that's fine. There's plenty of stuff to challenge in the new one. Slavery is still acknowledged and supported, and matter of fact, it's encouraged for slaves to obey their masters, including the cruel masters, and I think that that's an immoral proclamation, and that the only thing you should tell a slave is to get out as fast as you can, and if you got a cruel master, you take whatever steps are necessary to escape and help others do it. How hard was that to write?
I think most Christians don't really even understand how the law and the new, like the Old and New Testament. You have to remember, like that heading New Testament, that divider in the Bible that says New Testament, that's added. There is no original manuscript for that divider. People put that in, and the idea is that you had this law. Yahweh made this deal with the Hebrews specifically, and a guy named Abraham, and he made a deal, and he said, I'll give you all this land, and I'll make your, descendants this great nation, and your job is to worship me solely, and wherever you go, I will protect you. And this was kind of unique because most gods were territorial gods, and so he was saying, I will travel with you and protect you everywhere, and you do everything I say, and I will, give you all this cool stuff. And so him and Abraham make the deal, and the Hebrew history in the Old Testament is one of, like, they keep falling away, and then God reneges on parts of the deal, and because they fell away and didn't keep their part of the deal, they weren't still worshiping him, and so he would say, well, then I'm going to have you enslaved, and so this goes on for a long time. And in the meantime, they have this law, this, like, elaborate, crazy, almost like Sharia-like law, where they're killing all these animals to atone for their sins. Like, say, sacrifice these animals makes up for your sin. The idea in the New Testament with Jesus, like after they get the story with the resurrection and all of that, you get this concept that comes out of that is that he was that sort of final perfect sacrifice, so that no more animals now have to be slaughtered in order to atone for your wrongdoing, because now there's a human sacrifice that was like a God sacrifice as well, that is a perfect sacrifice that atones for sin all across the board now. And so from that, you end up with people saying, well, we don't have this law anymore. But there becomes a big confusion that happens, because the law never applied to anybody but the Hebrews anyway. Okay, it wasn't a law for anybody but the Hebrews. So unless you're a Jew, you're not bound to that full gamut of the law as a Christian, because Christians they were a subset of Jews, and then they started taking in Gentiles. And then there's these debates that happen in the Bible. Like you can see in the New Testament, the arguments about can we take non-Jews into this group of, the Christian churches, or should we not? And if we do take them in, what are they obligated to? Do they have to become Jews first? Do they have to convert to Judaism in order to be a Christian? And there's all these debates that happen in, like, Acts, for example. You've got Acts 15, Acts 21. And ultimately it's very confused. There's not like a resolution. But ultimately how I read it is that Paul finally, who was like the Gentile champion of put Gentiles in the church, he finally comes down on the side of the Jews should keep the law, But the Jews in the church, the Christian Jews, should keep the law. The Gentile Christians need to come in, and there's some laws they should keep because everybody knows these laws, and Moses has been preached in the synagogues for years and years and years, and these are good laws, and so they need to keep to the sexual immorality laws. They need to refrain from meat sacrificed to idols. They don't need to be circumcised, and they don't have to, the rest of the law will kind of let them off, because if you make them have to adhere to the Jewish law, it's just going to lower our numbers. So kind of as a weird marketing thing, Paul makes this compromise where he says, let's make them adhere to some of the law. But the Jewish Christians are going to adhere to all of it, and not only are they going to adhere to all of it, but they're going to raise their children in the law as well while they're in the Christian church. So the idea that the law is just done away with is sort of like this blanket thing that Christians are taught from a pulpit, but not many of them actually go into their Bibles and read the details about what exactly was going on with that.
This actually, there's a couple of things that tie together, which I think demonstrably prove that the bulk of the Christian and Jewish doctrine is false. And that is that Jews are under the Abrahamic covenant and Gentiles are under the Noahic covenant, because the Bible teaches that everybody on earth is spawned from the 8 people who survived on Noah's Ark. And since we know that that's a bunch of hogwash, clearly their entire basis for making a distinction between two groups is false. And when we go back to this idea of original sin and the idea that not only are you presumed guilty or born guilty because of this introduction of sin, but that the covenant that you're under is based on your bloodline and all these other things, when scientifically we know we can trace our ancestry back, and that there are civilizations that appear to be completely oblivious to this global flood thing and the survival of 8 individuals. It's one of those things where there are Christians who say, well, of course it wasn't a global flood. And there are other Christians who will say that it was a global flood. The ones that are saying it was, some of them are saying so because they understand that there's a big problem with their theology if it wasn't a global flood. If it was just a regional flood where these 8 people survived, and so you've got this 8 people spawning a couple of lineages, one that leads to the Jews and one that leads to the Gentiles. What about all of those other people who lived in other areas? They're not under either one of those covenants, and none of this stuff applies to them. It's this web of absurdity that you get when people who don't know what actually happened in the past start writing a history about what happened in the past.
If you try to get clarification, if you're looking for what is the Christian Orthodox view on the law, you're not going to find consensus. And there's not going to be like, oh, here's what Christians think about they're all going to have this concept of this, there's a different thing now. But as far as how it applies and why and what to do with it, they're all different. You're not going to. It's going to be a hard argument because they all have different ideas about it, and most of them are going to change their ideas and start tweaking them as soon as they have to start answering questions because they haven't looked into it before. Most of them.